Hi.
Hey, yes, happy to hear your voice.
Happy to hear you too. It's been a couple of days, but now it seems like part of our routine to do these things, so it feels good to be here.
It's very centering routine as well, as much as of all our work that we need to do. And let's be totally honest that last time it was very hard to do Ukrainian spaces because we exited a very dark weekend and it was very hard to concentrate, to talk, to form your even thoughts and into sentences. But we powered through this, and unfortunately, what is coming ahead is going to be even more darker as we face probably 100 of Buchas in eastern Ukraine in coming weeks. But one thing that we've learned over these weeks that the only response that works to terrorism is just to power through this and double down on the work that we've been doing before, right? I think
Absolutely.
this is the only approach. And oh, good God, the Russian troll farm is back as well. I've got so much feedback from them in the last 3 days. And as I see, a lot of other Ukrainians are doing the same, including death threats, including harassment. Yeah, so this is something, be mindful, folks, as well. Try to report as much as possible. The only question that I have at this point is not why Russian troll farms are back harassing us, but what in the hell big tech platforms have been doing all these years, because this is not the first time we're facing, but every time as if, things just zero in and start anew.
100%. Even platforms that were a little bit better, like Instagram, and were a little bit more safe in terms of the sort of the way that we've been getting feedback. Well, feedback is a strong word. But anyway, even those platforms are getting a lot of these, as you said, troll farms back in action. So more needs to be done for sure for us to be expressing ourselves in a safe way.
Yeah. For everyone else, first, Ukrainian Spaces, if you're first time here, this is the reason why we created with Valeria some weeks ago. We see millions of Ukrainians with perfect English sharing their stories across all social media platforms. Yet, 42 days into genocide, the conversations about Ukraine are still dominated by mostly Western, mostly white, mostly male folks. And not only it continuously robs Ukrainians of their agency, it also perpetuates outdated, misleading, and false narratives about Ukraine and Ukrainians. And we want to foster a relaxed, safe, and chill space for Ukrainian voices to express themselves without the need of fitting Western boxes, and the rest can use the space to educate themselves and to maybe decolonize your views of Ukrainians. But I see that Alina is already with us as a co-host. Alina, are you here with us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Great.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Alina, we have a very ground basic rule for every featured Ukrainian. We don't introduce them. We let them to introduce themselves the way they want, to share whatever they want about who they are, what they do. So please go ahead, teach us how to spell your name right, what do you do, and what kind of work you're doing these days as well.
My name is Alina, and I am a Ukrainian YouTuber, and perhaps, I hope, one day a published author, whenever the concept of publishing in books comes back from war. And also, I'm a film critic, and generally speaking, I am a very unemployed person, but with with stuff to do.
But I also I also love what you do online in terms of, especially these days, because, so many Ukrainians are activated and try to do their best in terms of not only probably educating everyone else about Ukraine, but also figuring out our own shit in terms of who we are, what we do. Can you tell me, in terms of what does it mean for you to be a Ukrainian? And I know it might be a bit a strange question these days, but we ask everyone because this is kind of a process that a lot of us are now are going through. You know, it's changing, and for many Ukrainians, it's changing as well. So, have you thought recently about what it does it mean for you to be a Ukrainian these days?
That's a fun question. So for me, being a Ukrainian, it's like the only scene I've ever been, really. The main scene I've ever been. And I mean, obviously, the recent and to some extent not so recent events have made me consider this question a little bit, to ponder about it a little, because the thing is that technically, like, I am probably one of those people that the Russian propaganda claims to be protecting, because my father is Russian, and but the interesting thing is that I've never ever considered myself Russian, not like for 1%, like for 5%. I've always considered myself only Ukrainian. So it's like an interesting conundrum now for me to kind of like, and for me also being a Ukrainian is it's for me being a Ukrainian is like being a guardian at the gate of Europe. I mean, it's not like, but not in like a weird like we are like real Westerners and Russians are like, I don't know, not really like white people over there, not in a weird way, okay? In a way that, Ukraine is a place where something is always happening, some shit is going down one way or another. And being Ukrainian is always fun. It always has been fun, and sometimes not in a fun way, but always in a way that ends up in a history book.
Yeah, because we talked with some other guests, like, for example, I'm Ukrainian, but I'm not ethnically Ukrainian. My family's, Georgian and Roma and Russian, and my first language was Russian, Ukrainian. And for me, Ukraine has always been something about a choice of values rather than ethnicity or language or geography. And I know so many other people who are, I would consider, honorary Ukrainians because they care about Ukraine, they work for Ukraine, but they've been born to other places, and this is just a set of values for them. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. Ukrainian. What is also very interesting and wonderful about Ukraine, about like this lens of ours, is that it has always been a very diverse place, and it has always been a place where various cultures intervened, various cultures met, and various cultures coexisted. Sometimes, not always, by the free will of those cultures, like, the infamous circle of ensettlement, or whatever it's called, like, in the Russian Empire, when the Russian Empire only allowed, for example, Jews to live in certain areas of the empire, and like a large part of those allowed territories, they were in modern Ukraine, and it kind of like a place that also kind of like it's really about values, because again, I've already mentioned my dad, who is Russian, but he seamlessly kind of integrated himself into my mom's family to the point that he's like undeniably Ukrainian and speaks perfect Ukrainian. And, the P word, and I mean like the terrible shibboleth Polyanitsa. He can say it perfectly. Yeah, because Ukraine has always been kind of like, once again, we have always been like this kind of like Kate of Europe, where certain like various people kind of mix and match and not always agree with each other and sometimes fight, but it means that it brings us like this very wonderful variety of cultures and like linguistic variety and like kind of all kind of like great things.
Absolutely, we had kind of a debate with one of our guests, like that the popular misconception that because Russia, for example, is such a big country, the amount of ethnicities and nations that live inside Russia is much bigger than Ukraine. And turns out, and I had to fact check this and verify, turns out Ukraine has more ethnicities living in Ukraine than in the whole entire Russia. I wanted, before I actually ask more about your work, which I love, I wanted to also double check how's your family doing. I mean, feel free to share whatever information you feel comfortable, but at least are they safe? Are you safe? So, if you feel comfortable sharing this kind of information.
No worries, I'm perfectly comfortable. So my parents spent 3 weeks under the Russian occupation. And they're still a bit traumatized about that. They, when the war started, they went to my mom's hometown near Trostianets, and so you can guess how well that turned out. Yeah. But they spent some not so great time under the occupation without power, without cell connection. Without gas or heating, but they managed to break out, and sometime later, luckily, the whole like region, the southern Sumy region, it was liberated. So, and after that, my family spent some time near Lviv, and now my parents are back in Sumy.
Okay.
And my elder sister and her kid are still in the West. As for me, I'm fine. I'm back in my Kyiv apartment, and I'm very glad. Yeah, I traveled a bit, but now I'm back home. We'll see you.
That's lovely to hear, because I know that a lot of people are coming back as well, at least to Kyiv, or at least those who left abroad. And this is understandable, because unlike many other refugee waves, a lot of families were separated, and and this is not something Ukrainians are generally very comfortable doing, just running away. So yeah, I'm happy to hear that this is, at least for your family, is a bit better than it was. I love your work because, like, when we were inviting you, I also remember this post from another Ukrainian on Twitter. I follow Sergei Mohov, and he writes, it's basically yesterday, that he says Westerners commenting they noticed a surge of Ukrainians speaking English and find it strange. These are people switching to your language to bring you truthful information about the worst thing that ever happened to them, because you've been fed Russian biased crap for decades. Some of us are more fluent in English than others. Some of us have had popular Ukrainian language YouTube channels, Twitter, Instagram accounts for a very long time. But now you, our Western audience, decide if you'll help our country and our people survive. So we write for you. Ukrainians know their history better than you do. Ukrainians and other Eastern Europeans also know Russia and Russians better than you ever will. US and EU academia and punditry have been polluted with Russian propaganda since the 60s. Soviets were largely successful in pushing their narratives and their version of history onto you, hiding every trace of Ukrainian, Georgian, and other national identities from Western audiences. They vilified our national heroes, ridiculed our languages, killed our artists, and so on. So I wanted to ask you, how's the war and genocide affecting what you are putting out there on YouTube, and what's been the kind of feedback so far? Has it changed?
I haven't actually posted anything since the war began. At the moment, I've been kind of considering like making a series of video on like how did we end up here, film, cinema-wise, film-wise, culturally-wise. But then once again, I'm looking at my channel, and that's like the whole subject of my channel, really. If we take what was it called, that insane op-ed like about the Ukrainianizing Ukrainians and like killing Ukrainians.
Oh yeah, the one that Russians posted about basically cleansing Ukraine of Ukraine.
Yeah. RIA Novosti, was it? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So it was actually written by a Russian scriptwriter who wrote a movie I reviewed several months ago.
No.
Yeah. So I'm like, I read the article and I was like, hey, that sounds familiar. I'll check who the author is, and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I see that.
So they're literally coming up with things on the go as the time goes. Creative writing, or whatever you can call it.
But I hope you gave him like not a very good review, right?
No, like the movie was horrible, and it was the interesting thing that it was deliberately filmed, kind of like, because it was released in 2012 when Ukraine hosted like the European football competition, something. I'm not good at sports. And it was about this urban legend, Kyiv urban legend, about a Kyiv-based football team that won against the Nazi team, and they all got shot, which is like not true, not what happened. But the urban legend persists, and the movie is kind of like, it suggests that the legend is obviously true, but it's also very like anti-Ukrainian and like pushes this narrative that all Ukrainians are Nazis. Excuse me, and the only good Ukrainians are the ones that abandon their identity in lieu of the great, Soviet identity, the generalized Soviet identity, I'm not one bit surprised that the scriptwriter of that movie now came up with this.
So for everyone who has joined us and who still is sometimes doubting where this hatred for years that has been cultivated has come from, it includes movies, it includes art, it includes literature, it includes so many different things. It's not a new phenomenon. It's been happening for quite some time. And I'm really glad to have Alina as well here talk about, connecting all the dots for those who may not know Ukraine as well. But I also, we did it. Mariam, we finally connected microphone, and I'm excited to see you here as well. We spoke about this earlier with Maksym. I actually saw a lot of the work that you've been doing on Instagram, and it's been so important. Everything from debunking Russian imperialism and why it needs Ukraine, and talking about culture and all other things. So we just wanted to ask you as well, Mariam, if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what being Ukrainian means to you.
Okay. Hi everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm not a big fan of podcasts, but my friend is, so he told me if I'll say thank you for having me, I will sound more like a pro. So here I am. and also it was a little bit complicated to also understand how does it work. But yeah, anyways, so what I'm doing and who am I? I'm a Bachelor of Cultural Studies, and I'm currently working in UX. So I'm UX researcher, but yeah, in my free time, I do some public speaking about the culture, popular culture mostly. And about your question, well, oh my God, this is very complicated. But so for me, like the question, what does it mean for me to be Ukrainian? It's very complicated because I always felt like imposter when I called myself Ukrainian, and it's connected to my origin. My father and my brother are from Afghanistan, and then born in Afghanistan, and they left the country in 1989 because of the war with USSR, and this might sound ironic. So for me, Ukraine always meant like home, also means home, like second home and second chance for other part of my family. So, and also like to be Ukrainian for me means to accept my difference, and always be ready for battle. I guess something like that.
Yeah, and we talked with Alina also just earlier that for so many Ukrainians, including, for example, myself, it's Ukraine is mostly a set of values rather than anything to do with anything language, ethnicity, or geography. And I always find it so powerful when I meet so many Ukrainians who, born in Ukraine or not born in Ukraine, doesn't matter. They're Ukrainian to the core, and especially in the last 40 days, that has solidified for so many of us, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I guess this is kind of interesting point that, for example, in Russia or in France, we can partly even talk about the US image of like cultural code, if you can say it. So, for example, in some countries, it was created by government. For example, Russia is a very good example of that. They actually built this propaganda for years. They connected imperialism, monarch imperialism, with nostalgia for USSR. But what is interesting about Ukraine is that we actually didn't have very specific cultural code that was created by, for example, by government or by someone. So we don't have very specific explanation what does it mean to be Ukraine, or what kind of set of rules or set of values. It's very vague feeling, but it's very interesting. Like when you see it, you know it. So like and I know, and everyone kind of understand what does it mean to be Ukrainian, but it's very complicated. It's not verbally easy to explain it right now. And also because again, Ukraine is pretty big country, and we have a lot of ethnicities. So it's also kind of, I think it's kind of interesting thing. So at some point when our ex-president had this phrase, it was, I think, army, language, and faith, as you remember. And it was very interesting that he didn't specify, which is very funny, because in the same time, we have a lot of languages in Ukraine. So it's not only one language. We have a lot of a different religion in Ukraine. It's not only one religion. So I guess it's kind of also interesting that we don't have specified meanings of what does it mean to be Ukrainian, what are our values. So we can create it right now. So I think it's very cool.
Yeah,
and it's a strength, right? It's a strength that we have in how we operate. It means different things to different people, but as you said, when we see it, we know it.
Yes, exactly.
But I also think that part of the reason is because Ukraine is emerging after centuries of colonial rule, and part of the colonial toolkit is to try to erase of our identities as much as possible, to rob of our voices, to rob of our history, our legacy. That's why so many of us, when we're coming out as children, learning about our own country where we're born, or we knew so little, and it always puzzled me Like, this is a land where statehood existed, in the 7th and 6th and 8th century, and still we don't know so much about it. And that's why, Mariam, I love your work as well on social media. Here's one of your Instagram posts before me on why is there so little talk about Russian imperialism, colonialism. And you say that nowadays many countries confront and reflect on their aggressive colonial past and present. Britain, Spain, the United States, and others. Russia is often not perceived as a colonial state due to the location of Russian colonies. Indeed, usually the colonies are far from the metropole. In the case of Russia, however, the colonies border ethnically Russian lands. And then you also explain how Russian colonialism is basically the same sequence of events from Russian Tsarist rule through Soviet rule, and it's basically changing the names, but remains in nature all the same. Can I ask you, because it's still very rare that people discuss what is happening in Ukraine and discuss Russian aggressive policies through colonialism lenses, how you came about yourself and started seeing this through the same focus?
I think, okay, so this story might be interesting. I didn't talk about that actually. So the thing is that 6 months ago, I wanted to do like an experiment. And typically I'm doing experiment. After that, I'm writing article about that. So I'm Russian speaker Ukrainian. Like I'm Russian speaking Ukrainian of Afghani origin. And of course, right now I'm trying to speak mostly Ukrainian. But this is completely true. Like most of the time I think in Russian, like this is the easiest way for me to describe what I feel and so on. So I wanted to do experiment, and after that, write article about it. So the idea of experiment was to listen to only Russian channels and read only Russian literature and use information only from Russian source for 1 month, and make a diary about that for each day, and have like and just see what I will feel in the end. I actually wrote the article, but I thought it would be too controversial, so I didn't publish it. And my idea was during listening to all of these Russian sources, I decided that I want to have also something else, just keep me sane. And I read some book of Eva Thompson about specifically colonialism in Russian literature. And I think it's very important because, again, maybe I'm talking right now only from myself, but for a lot of Ukrainians, and specifically when you study in the school, you have this very strange feeling that Ukrainian literature is not so great as Russian literature. And you have this idea that Russian literature is so important, and everyone knows who is Dostoevsky and so on and so on. So for me, it was very interesting to, while I'm listening to all of this Russian propaganda, at the same time try to read some critical information about Russian culture that actually had a big impact on us. Because again, all Ukrainians, we read Russian literature in Russian language. It wasn't translated books or something. And when I read Eva Thompson, I was just shocked because everything that, again, it was very vague. Like I had this strange feeling towards Russia culture. I couldn't explain it, but everything that I felt and I thought and I observed was exactly there. And actually, it was the same when I saw Alina's video. Like everything that she was talking about, Eva Thompson also described. So I thought I think it's very vital and a very important book for Ukrainians right now. So if you're curious, I think.
Oh, this is fantastic. Folks, listen up. I think as a someone who's trying to mainstream the talks about Russian colonialism for several years now, it's always been the same kind of struggle for me to find sources and find good works, because I'm not an academic or researcher. I'm just a journalist trying to connect the dots in all this Russian colonialism stories, and it's very hard to find any content because, again, Russia works very well to erase that kind of evidence and erase even that kind of conversation, because this is a last standing colonial empire that has been, covering up their colonial crimes for so many centuries. But this is, I really love your work for that, because this is very refreshing. And thank you so much for doing that and educating people and pushing that also to the mainstream. This is extremely important. Valeria, I know that you also had a question to both of our featured Ukrainians.
Yeah. It's actually a question we ask all of our guests, because it's really important to ask this question from everyone's different perspective. And obviously today we're talking about culture, about cinema, about just in general Russian imperialism and things like that. So I wanted to ask both Alina and Mariam just what, in terms of media coverage of what's happening in Ukraine, what has happened in Ukraine in the past, what is like the one big myth that you want to counter or call out, or make sure that people understand that it's not the way that the media has been reporting, media outside of Ukraine has been reporting on that? Maybe Alina, you can start, and then Mariam.
Okay, so I don't want to say the Nazi scene, because it's like so overused and and it's so forced. The worst thing about this trope is that it kind of stuck with the Western audience, as it worked. They managed to convince a part of the Western audience, especially the had seen, young people and a lot of young progressive kind of people into this Nazi scene. But if I would change, would want to highlight one scene in depiction of Ukraine, is that it seems that Ukrainian is a tiny small country on the outskirts, who is fighting against this big gigantic scene. I know why it works, because people like a good David versus Goliath story. People, especially in the West, the way the way Western culture, Western pop culture is constructed, the way it works, people love themselves a good underdog story, but also it kind of diminishes, the way how big Ukraine are and how diverse Ukraine are and how much people and peoples live here. So I really don't like this scene about small tiny Ukraine with small tiny army, with I don't know fucking swords or something, who's standing against this big empire, this kind of Star Wars rebels versus the empire scene.
Although Star Wars very speaks to me in this whole situation, but you're absolutely right. And I think another important thing that this narrative, David versus Goliath, is kind of helps many foreigners to feel better about their lack of action, because they keep telling that, Ukrainians will, overcome, they will defeat, the empire will fall, and then it helps them to create this false sense of security and accomplishment, that whatever has been done already been done, and then the rest of the job is up to Ukrainians, which in fact, of course, we will win. But the question is, how many of us will die? And if people do not help the way we ask them to help, this count will be in millions, because it has already happened to Ukraine before, and we faced genocide, and we faced similar conquests, and it did result in many deaths. So sorry, this is just my comment.
No, I absolutely agree. It's a very good point. If you look at Ukrainian history at large, you can spot a lot of a lot of 300 Spartans, one valiant last stand kind of stories, a lot of light brigades.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mariam, what's your frustration? Like one thing that really, really irritates you in foreign coverage of Ukraine these days?
So I guess it's actually the same as Alina said about nationalism, but in my case, I guess as a person who were exposed to racism in Ukraine and out of Ukraine, for me it's even like more irritating and more frustrating because I guess that in connection with the migration crisis in some Western countries, the problems of Ukraine are viewed through the prism of today's issues of Europe. And here I'm talking, of course, about nationalism and racism in Ukraine. And this is an important thing because we actually have far-right groups, but there is another important thing that nobody kind of discuss. So, for example, ultra-right battalion Azov is often mentioned in the media. You can see a lot of articles about it, Al Jazeera, CNN, and The Guardian, for example. So what is the date of creation of Azov? It is 2014. And what is the date of Russia attack on Ukraine? It's actually 2014 also. So the current rise of the Ukrainian nationalist movement is linked to Russia's expansive aggression. This is a very important thing. Like, of course, it's not explaining everything, but it definitely linked to Russia's expansive aggression. Also, I kind of always want to highlight how important is language, like Ukrainian language to Ukraine. It's not so frustrating as a topic of nationalism and racism, but I think it's important also to highlight that from the standpoint of culture, Ukraine has been deprived of its cultural heritage for centuries. Ukrainian artists and writers were killed, and they didn't have the opportunity to work, for example. So due to many features, the most critical aspects of Ukrainian culture is the language, and actually, which was subject to linguicide. So it's important that the idea that we have two languages in Ukraine, it's not the legacy of luck, it's legacy of Russian colonial policy. Because you can also see it a lot in Western media, how people try to explain the country, the culture of Ukraine by creating this map that divides that one part is like red and another part is blue, just to explain, okay, this part speaking Russian, this part speak Ukrainian, and this is just a fact. So I guess this is kind of important. Sorry, it's not one thing, it's two things. It's nationalism, the myth about great Ukrainian nationalists, and the idea that Ukrainian language is the very important aspect of the culture.
Yeah, well, you guys, you can share how many examples you would like. This is the platform for you to claim it and to use it the way you want it. Mariam, can I ask you a quick follow-up? Because you mentioned the problem with nationalism and racism. Yeah. And of course, this is, again, as much as you're comfortable to share. But what do you think is the biggest misconception or myth when it comes to racism inside Ukraine? Because this is something that I also face these conversations and questions all the time, especially from people who say that this prevents them from supporting Ukraine because Ukraine is, somewhat racist or exclusively white or other nonsense. But what do you think is like the biggest misconception could be there, especially from a person who also faced racism in Ukraine on some levels? Can you, whatever you feel comfortable sharing?
It's interesting because, again, publicly I never talked about it, but I think we need to be honest here, as Ukrainians also. Do we have racism in Ukraine? Yes. Is it bigger racism than in any other countries in Europe? No, for sure. You can see it from the election, for example, that Ukrainian kind of right party had only 2% votes in 2018. Like it's not a very big issue. And again, I'm trying to explain it from my side, a person who kind of actually had a big problem with racism in Ukraine. And of course, it wasn't very, very pleasant. The thing is that I had experienced, like I lived in US and I lived in Europe in different countries. And to be honest, racism in Ukraine and racism in Western countries are very different racism. again, right now, I'm trying to put all of my emotion in kind of words, but it's a little bit difficult. So in US, for example, or in Europe, I always felt like racism had more structure into society, like in the institutions. Ukrainian racism was a little bit different. It's more like it was more like not understanding who is this person who doesn't look like me, or why you have different, I don't know, it's hard to say, I don't know, tradition in your family or something like that. So it wasn't like like for me, this is the biggest difference that Ukrainian racism is not so linked to the institutions like in Europe. But and again, I think it's also important. I had some issues, through all my life, and I spent a lot of time in Kyiv. I born in this city, so I can say for sure the amount of far right organization, or like the feeling of the threat that I had in past and today, it's very different. Like I actually had a lot of not pleasant times in past, in 2000s, for example. Also, I can say that about my brothers and my father. But right now, like there is no issues. And so I also did this experiment when I was wearing hijab for 1 week in Kyiv, and try to feel what actually people, like how people will react and how society is actually ready for this kind of changes. And I wrote an article about that actually people were very pleasant and very nice. So sometimes, I had even this feeling that maybe it's actually also my prejudice. So yeah, but again, this part is like very, like, sorry that it's not very structured, because again, there is a lot of emotions in this topic. But
no, this is amazing, and I thank you so much for sharing. And I think it's totally another conversation as well. And I'm not the person to talk about racism, because although I have some Roma roots, but I totally pass as white. But I also kind of encourage people to think about racism when it comes to Eastern Europe within the critical racial theory as well. That when Eastern Europeans say that they know what racism is because they're treated as second-class white people by the West, by America, by so many people, by even Russians who installed a specific racial-like kind of structure within the colonial rule that would treat Ukrainians as second class for centuries. As a person who lived in Moscow, also faced all this nasty shit about being chochol and and if I don't shave, being khach. So this is this is something that we know what we're talking about, even if it does not really fit the conversation in the West. Valeria, I think we wanted to ask also Alina and Mariam a bit their social media kind of presence, because we need to wrap it up. Can I ask Alina first and you ask Mariam?
For sure, go ahead.
Alina, we talked about your YouTube a bit, but since you review a lot of stuff and put culture in context, is there something in terms of Ukrainian culture, focus on Ukrainian culture, that you think is not amplified, is not featured out there for foreign audience to know? Something that really fascinates you these days. Maybe it's related to colonialism or not, but maybe something really that you would like others to explore and educate themselves.
Okay, so as a film critic, I mean, obviously I say Ukrainian film because Ukrainian film is not like Ukrainian cinema is not like the most obscure shit if you're a cinephile, because you probably know Dovzhenko, some of Parachano, but like Parachano doesn't really read as Ukrainian for many Western cinephile, but that's fine. Parachano is one of those Ukrainians, just like you said, Ukrainian by choice, Ukrainian by values. Ukrainian by the fact that we kind of like accepted him in our big Ukrainians and decided that he was our guy. Yeah. But we do have a lot of like wonderful, Ukrainian films that might be interesting for foreign audiences, and I do hope that even under such unfortunate circumstances, maybe the recent event would encourage the platforms like Criterion and others to pick up more Ukrainian films and showcase them for Western audiences with English subtitles and stuff. Also, this is kind of niche. This is very niche, but I've been working on a series of videos about, the history of Ukrainian theater and, the way Ukrainian theater and film worked with Shakespeare, because March was... March kind of like the official Shakespeare month, and so on my channel it was meant to be all about theater of theater, but my life is now theater of action, theater of war, as it's called. So that's unfortunate. And looking up Ukrainian Ukrainian theater, there's some really fascinating stuff to be found there, and Ukrainian early modern theater, and also and just modern theater, the theater Ukrainians are doing today is very fascinating. Check it out. I don't have many concrete recommendations for you. I would check out what Ivano-Frankivsk Drama Theater is doing now. They are I am so jealous of all people who evacuated to Ivano-Frankivsk and can go to their wonderful productions that they hold in their basement. In the bomb shelter, it's just amazing. Just YouTube it, Google it on YouTube, whatever. And, and also what some stuff that Zhytomyr theater does, and especially their production of V by Nikolai Gogol, which is a very wonderful, a very kind of interesting figure in both Russian and Ukrainian cultures, and kind of but it's I'm not gonna talk about it, but he's both Russian and Ukrainian, and it's kind of been
controversial.
It's kind of how do you call that game when one side tries to snatch a rope from the other? So we've been kind of tugging him in different directions, so that's fun. And their production of V is just wonderful. And if we go in film, which is my specialty or whatever, I really kind of for English speaking audiences, this is for cinephiles in English speaking cinephiles. Check out Ukrainian Canadian films. If you can find them, check out them. They are very interesting. It's a very unique kind of Ukrainian exploitation. I do want one day to make a video about them.
Thank you so much, Alina. I think I'm going to go after this. You've given me loads of ideas of how to enrich my understanding and knowledge of Ukrainian culture. So thank you so much for that. And finally, last question. I know that many of us have to go. We only said we would do this for an hour. But as I said before, I sort of was introduced to Mariam's work through Instagram, and her post that went viral was around Russian imperialism. So before we finish, I wanted to ask you, Mariam, if that's okay. So why does Russian imperialism need Ukraine?
Okay. So it seems like geographical expansion is vital for the Russian regime now. However, such trends have been always, it's typical for all empires. And as far as, but to be honest, it also concerns neighboring countries, ethnic groups next to Russia. and in Russia. Because, for example, most people think about Russian people as a just, like average Caucasian person, which is not true. There is a lot of different ethnic groups, but they are erased by image of a specific Russian person. As far as Ukraine is concerned, the narrative of rebelliousness plus a large territory of Ukraine, it always constantly has undermined Russia's self-image. Like Ukraine has always been that boy in fairy tale who shouted, "The king is naked," and Russia didn't like it then, and doesn't like it now. So I think it's one of the important thing that Ukraine constantly undermined Russia's self-image. This is the reason why Russia needs Ukraine right now so much.
That is so powerful, and I hope
Thank
everyone remembers your words as well. And both of you, it's been really great to have you. This has been amazing, and I hope for everyone who's listening to us right now, these two amazing women have basically shown you that there are amazing young people who speak amazing English, who have a lot of knowledge and information that you should get your information from, your sources from. And, we Ukrainians have a lot to share and a lot to say. And we just hope that you follow us and listen to us. And please follow both Mariam and Alina on their respective social media platforms where they continue to do their work. But I'll pass over to Maksym for final words.
I don't have any final words. I mean, I'm so thankful because you're absolutely right. I love what you guys do, but I also love how fresh your perspective. I mean, I consider myself in Eastern European age. I'm in mid-30s. I'm already almost near my retirement age. But I just remember how boring and how unimaginative and how horribly misplaced conversations about Ukraine have always been abroad in the West. And thanks to voices like yourself, we're trying to change it and bring reality and freshness and to center them within Ukrainian voice. So thank you. Guys, thank you so much once again.
Thank you, both Mariam and Alina. Thank you so much.
Slava Ukraini.
Thank you for having us.